The annual Israeli high-tech human capital report was put out this week with some great highlights. Honestly, over 30,000 job openings in the high-tech sector, despite economic downturns worldwide. And significantly, a survey conducted by the Startup Nation Policy Institute and the Israeli Innovation Authority showed a 250% increase in job openings for non-technological positions in Israel. Now, per the report, quote, the Institute works in partnership with the public sector and the high-tech industry to advance policies that maintain Israel's technological edge and expand Israeli innovation to all areas of its economy and society, close quote. So a lofty and important mission, and along those lines, now we're joined by Uri Gabai, the CEO of Startup Nation Policy Institute, in the studio. Thanks for being with us here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure being here.
Big changes, it appears, from previous years. Is it all positive? Are things still looking good in the industry?
Look, we basically published this report, and the report analyzes what's happened in the last 18 months. Now, as we know, the global economy and specifically the high-tech,
crazy time.
Crazy times, and you know, things are changing as we speak. We're definitely, when we look at the future, we're definitely going to see some downturn. The downturn already started. You know, the Israeli high-tech is very connected to global markets. So, you know, once global markets slow down, you know, investments coming into Israeli high-tech will go down a bit. The markets of the Israeli high-tech is always abroad. It's hardly in Israel. Sure. So, you know, the Israeli high-tech is going to be affected by that.
Not immune from the global issues at all. And certainly, I guess the secret of success is certainly really connected to the global issues here. But is the sector, I mean, the sector has seen years of really crazy growth here, unprecedented investment. Is all that still sort of on track despite all the global hiccups?
It's not on track. We'll definitely see some reduction. And I think it's not necessarily a bad thing. Okay. You know, I think that the Israeli high-tech was slightly out of proportion in the last 18 months. We've seen salaries going through the roof. We've seen investments and valuations of companies, good companies, but the valuations were, you know, slightly exaggerated. And I think that this downturn, which we all hope that will be as short as possible, I think it will bring some sanity back to this sector. And I think it's important.
And in terms of it being important, I mean, why important, or what would that do? I mean, it's sort of rein it back in, make things more long-term feasible. I mean, what's the upside to sort of a slowdown a little bit?
Yeah. So what we're seeing, for instance, and we talk about this in the report, we're seeing that Israeli companies, mainly startups, they have extremely hard time competing over talent. You know, they have to compete not just with the Apple and Google and Facebooks of the world. They have to compete with Israeli unicorns that are going through the roof, cutthroat
like
industry,
mercenaries,
and they're basically fighting for a rather small pool of talent. And, you know, at the end, you want a good 200, 300 Israeli startups to really take this to the next level, because you want to see this industry sustainable, and not just in the present, but also 5 and 10 years from now.
It's still positioned to be sort of Israel's leading industry for the next decade to come?
Oh, for sure, for sure. Look, when we talk about Israel, we must take into account this is the most productive sector and will continue to be so in the foreseeable future. I don't see any sector in the next 20 years that will come even close to the level of productivity of the Israeli high-tech.
I mean, and the leading question in my mind then is how? How, you know, Israel's clearly gotten attention in the last 20 years, really, the startup nation, the technological prowess. But everyone around the world is paying attention. I mean, a lot of other small countries in particular are looking at this and saying, how do we replicate this? So how does Israel maintain that lead at the front of this pack all these years to come?
Yeah, so I mean, the first answer is we started much earlier than other countries. You know, we started, the Israeli innovation policies that started from government supporting high-tech started in the 1980s. Okay, way before other countries were even thinking about this. And I think the ecosystem grew, evolved over time, and in the right pace. It's very market-driven, so the government supports it but doesn't intervene too much. And I think it's a very, very healthy industry. And again, we must take into account, if you were now in New York and you're a very talented person, you can choose between, you know, finance, you can choose between many different sectors, high-tech being one of them. In Israel, it's probably, you know, the most attractive sector.
It's certainly the most coveted, yes, attractive. Looking at the country, I mean, you think of Israel, startup nation, the high-tech sector that's world-renowned, world-leading. The country, has it kept up, though, in terms of infrastructure, bureaucracy, digitalization? I mean, you would expect to see Israel being like the most forward-leaning, progressive, digitalized, electronic country in the world. It doesn't feel that way around here. I mean, there are great advancements, but why isn't that translating into society?
So that's an excellent question. And at Startup Nation Policy Institute, which I lead, this is one of the main questions that we're dealing with. How to get the technological prowess and the innovation back into Israelis that may not be in high tech, but may want to enjoy better health, better education, better transportation. We know that Israel has many exciting startups in transportation, but I was stuck in traffic here just outside your studio for maybe 25 minutes.
Standard affair, yeah.
And that's one of the main challenges that I think the Israeli economy is facing.
Okay. Maybe we'll see more of that in the decade to come, a bit more infusion of all this great tech into our everyday lives locally. But Uri Gabai, thanks for being with us, and keep up the good work.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Now, just a year ago, as we transitioned from this, Cuba faced the most widespread protests since the revolution. Now, hundreds of people have been sent to prison for going out and demanding better living conditions, and concerns remain that new revolts are on the horizon. Take a look.
When the largest anti-government protests here since the Cuban Revolution took place last July, thousands of people poured into the street. Demonstrators demanded food, medicine, and political changes in spontaneous marches across the island. Protests even took place in smaller cities like San Jose de las Lajas, where brothers Nadir and Jorge Perdomo, both teachers, addressed this crowd of people that residents say remain peaceful.
Mis hijos salieron porque, como todo cubano.
My sons went out because, like every Cuban, they were desperate over the situation. The two men's mother told us they are fathers. Every day here, we have less. The government crackdown was swift and harsh. As police arrested hundreds of protesters, Nadir and Jorge made a last video where they said they were merely expressing the discontent that many Cubans feel. Days later, the two brothers were arrested. According to court records that CNN reviewed, neither man had a prior criminal record, and both were well regarded in their community. All the same, Jorge was sentenced to 8 years in prison and Nadir to 6 years after being convicted of charges including disorderly behavior and insulting public officials. Human rights groups say the Cuban government is trying to intimidate their own people from taking to the streets again.
And we found that constantly prosecutors were charging Cubans for exercising their basic rights, such as the right to protest peacefully, the right to insult the president, or to insult police officers exercising their freedom of expression.
It remains to be seen, though, whether the mass trials will succeed in silencing dissent. A year after the protests took place, and many of the economic problems that Cubans confront have only gotten worse. There are frequent blackouts that last for hours and seemingly endless lines for food and fuel. Although the Cuban government has succeeded in cracking down on the social unrest, many Cubans say it could explode again at any moment. So far, the government here says nearly 500 people have been convicted and sentenced for their roles in the protests, with some demonstrators receiving up to 25 years after being convicted of sedition. Officials say the protests were not the result of worsening living conditions on the island, but a campaign of sabotage carried out by Cuba's Cold War enemy, the United States government. But Marta Perdomo says no one had to encourage her sons to protest.
No, para nada. Mis hijos no fueron pagados.
My sons weren't paid. They didn't have to go out, but they felt the pain of Cuba, she says.
Pero ese día mis hijos fueron libres.
My sons were free that day, she says. Marta says that local officials have ordered her to take down a sign she put up on the front of her house in a rare act of defiance, calling for the release of her two sons. But the sign will stay up, Marta says, until her sons finally are able to come home. Patrick Ottman, CNN, San Jose de las Lajas.
Stepping out for yet another break here on Zoom In. We'll be right back with some of the latest around the Brittany Griner saga playing out between the U.S. and Russia there. I'd like to highlight the developments in that case. Also, more look inside the country, specifically at our airport. It's not a pretty picture. So we'll be right back after another break on Zoom In.